huge number of people, actually, lots of student faces that I recognise. So welcome and thank you for coming. We have a really great schedule of seminars lined up for you this semester, and also some public lectures as well. What do we have? On October the 11th, we have the British Academy Radcliffe Brown Lecture in Social Anthropology, and that will be on October the 11th. And then we also have a Monroe lecture with Sarah Franklin speaking on the 22nd of November. So lots of events along these lines coming up over this semester. But today we have Dr. Ayaz Qureshi kicking off the seminar series. And Ayaz joined us in the Social Anthropology Department in January this year. So it's a real pleasure to have him. It's been fantastic to have him join us as a colleague, and it's going to be a real pleasure to have him give us a paper about his research today. Ayaz recently had a new book published in 2017 called AIDS in Pakistan, Bureaucracy, Public Goods and Civil Society, which is highly recommended. And today his paper is on a similar topic. It's entitled HIV Prevention, Public Morality and Religious Leaders in Pakistan. So from what I understand, it's going to be religion and HIV and kind of like the role or whatever the role is of religious leaders in HIV prevention. So over to you, Ayaz. You have an hour to speak, and then there will be some questions and answers afterwards, and then a welcome back event, reception on the 6th floor. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky, and thank you all for coming. Thank you, Becky and colleagues, for giving me this opportunity to talk about my research. I did publish a book from PhD, but this is not part of the published material. This is different. This is something that I'm trying to develop, and I would really welcome your feedback on some of the questions that I raised during this presentation. So this is not something that I have already accomplished. It's a work in progress. I'm trying to use some of the material that I have engaged with during the PhD and try to look at things from a distance. Now, PhD was a few years back, and try to make sense of that material in light of the current debates around morality and HIV prevention in Pakistan. So I'll read from paper, and please bear with me if you find some of the details very boring, but this is an important part of the story that I want to tell you in order to raise the questions that I want to raise today. So what I'm going to read is basically trying to sketch the landscape in terms of HIV prevention and public morality in Pakistan, the landscape that we need to be familiar with if we want to address some of the questions that I will raise at the end of the talk. So the first case of HIV in Pakistan was diagnosed in 1986. The government set up a vertical disease prevention program with the help of WHO. Vertical programs, those of you who are not familiar with vertical programs, these are health programs which are focused on a particular disease or on a particular high-risk population or a particular area. In this case, a vertical program which had not much to do with horizontal district level or sub-district level or province level health bureaucracy, but this was a vertical program run from the federal government and targeting a specific subsection of the population to prevent a specific disease and not really to look at health and illness in a broader kind of context. So vertical programs were very popular at that time and had been set up in many other countries as well. However, despite the establishment of National AIDS Control Program, the National Health Policy of 1990, which was dubbed as the People's Health Policy, did not contain any mention of HIV. According to some commentators, this omission was a result of the political shyness of the democratic government of Benazir Bhutto's Pakistan People's Party, which had come to power after a decade-long military dictatorship of Zia-ul Haq and did not want to be associated with Western disease linked to bad habits of foreigners. Up to the late 1990s, the government health bureaucracy had negligible involvement with HIV/AIDS, and little attempt was made towards mainstreaming the HIV/AIDS prevention and care in health and delivery system. Meanwhile, the number of individuals diagnosed with HIV increased from just 50 in 1990 to more than 1,000 in 1995. By 1994, the government was pushed to initiate a media campaign for HIV and AIDS awareness. Sensitive to Islamic public morality, those media messages were not explicit about the causes of disease. For example, one TV advertisement which aimed at condom promotion showed a sequence of shadowy outlines of people in dark street fending off torrential monsoon rain by using their umbrella. This was followed by a warning, protect yourself, AIDS is incurable. In the follow-up evaluation, a large number of respondents reported that they had thought this advert was about using umbrellas in rain. So instead of explicit messages, people were invited to call a dedicated hotline for more detailed information. The hotline delivered pre-recorded messages about the importance of condom use for HIV/AIDS prevention and encouraged those who suspected themselves of infection to go for HIV testing. Callers could leave their addresses and phone numbers or visit the National AIDS Control Program if they wanted more information. The hotline received hundreds of calls and letters every week. The NACP also held sessions with Islamic leaders and journalists to obtain their support for AIDS awareness work, something that I'll come more explicitly to later on in this paper. By the mid-1990s, a group of public health experts who were associated with Aga Khan University in Karachi and the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta organized the first national conference on AIDS in Karachi. The conference emphasized the central importance of risky practices and behaviors for HIV prevention. Epidemiological studies presented at this conference showed that HIV was associated with commercial sex workers, drug users, transgendered people, locally called hijre, men who have sex with men, and internal migrants, all of whom came to be labeled as high-risk groups. However, the definitions of risk groups were guided by a broad international classification, with existing local research merely confirming risky behavior in predefined groups rather than providing definitions from inductive research. As medical anthropologist Nguyen observes in case of HIV in West Africa, in order to govern populations by exceptional AIDS response, the population must first exist and be available, and that the risk population must be called into being through procedures that allow it to be identified, separated, and counted. In Pakistan, this was accomplished in 2003 by setting up the HIV/AIDS Surveillance Project. The surveillance project not only delineated risk groups from the general population in accordance with transnational templates, but also found it convenient to fix the blame and the epidemiological gaze on injecting drug users, hijre, and sex workers in large urban centers. It reduced homosexuality to male sex work only, and it opened the gates of typologizing female sex workers into subcategories such as street-based or brothel-based. The project estimated the numbers and types of risk populations in rural areas on the basis of assumptions derived from studies conducted in rural populations of India. So for example, if in India, they had found in these surveys that in a village of 10,000, there was one brothel or two brothels, and there were 2 prostitutes in those 2 brothels, 10 prostitutes, and same should be true for Pakistan because culturally they are same. So that is how they calculated the number of risk population, female sex workers, as well as hijre and MSM. So this is how the epidemic was visualized in Pakistan. What does this picture tell us, this diagram tell us? There are several things. One of them is the sheer magnitude that it is showing. So in 2011, for instance, according to the estimates, there were 89,000 female sex workers, hijra sex workers, likewise 23,000 injecting drug users. And the other thing it shows, this diagram shows, is the overlap. So 4.9% overlap between FSWs and IDUs, for instance. So, and the third thing that comes up from looking at this diagram is this kind of a closed circuit of risk. between these high-risk kind of populations because of their high-risk sexual activity. They're having sex with each other. You can see the numbers there, and they are a risk to the society because of this closed circuit of sexual or intense kind of sexual activity between these groups of people. So with this domestication of AIDS in Pakistan, those who were already marginalized and stigmatized in the society were now seen to be not only at risk of contracting HIV due to their shameful, immoral lifestyle, but were also seen as a threat to the general population, the innocent masses. Therefore, in order to contain the virus, targeted interventions were deemed necessary for these risk groups. However, as I have hinted before with reference to medical anthropologist Nguyen's quotation, that these groups must first be created because except for the hijre or transgendered people, and to some extent female sex workers, there was no real sense of being distinct from others or a distinct community or subgroup among the target population itself. Now I'll go into some detail on a hijre social organization or transgender social organization, although I realize many of us are expert in that field now. But I will just very generally kind of outline the social organization of hijra community in Pakistan in order to just kind of give you some idea of the moral landscape. So hijra are uniquely South Asian phenomena, often translated as transgender, but different in many respects from their Western counterparts who are designated in these terms. So they're not drag queens, for example. They are organized into well-connected networks of mutual support. The organizing principle, or one of the organizing principles in these networks, is the guru-chela relationship, roughly translated as master-disciple. Dera or dere, where gurus live with their chele, serve as temporal and spatial nodes of the network. A dera is not very different from a patriarchal household where the rule of the father reigns supreme and where the dependent and the deviant and people who do not conform are often abused. For example, a chela who lives at his guru's dera surrenders half of his or her income to the guru, who pools together all that money from his chele in order to run the household with it. By hijra norms, the gurus are expected not only to initiate their chela into hijra word in very elaborate rituals while establishing the guru-chela bond, they must also take care of the chela's spiritual and material well-being, for which they are expected to teach them the value system and ritual observance of hijra existence. Therefore, a guru takes most of the decisions for his or her chela. For example, when and where any of his chela will be part of the hired dance party or a begging party that goes door to door or begs at the traffic lights. If a hijra sells sex, it is usually also the guru who negotiates charges with the clients and or makes sure that it is safe for the chela to go to the client's place to provide sex or to provide sex at the dera. Hijra divide their neighborhoods among lines of gurus and deras who inherit these neighborhoods through generations of gurus. So it is a bit like agnatic kinship where property goes through male line. So here also neighborhoods in large cities are divided among these gurus and their deras, and they are inherited by the lines of gurus. This system of division gives them exclusive rights to ritually bless the neighborhoods, residents on occasions of marriage and childbirth, or beg on the streets, or lay claim to children born with ambiguous genitals. The gurus also have a keen eye on young girlish boys in their neighborhoods who are not accepted by their families for bringing shame. Gurus provide such boys shelter at their dera and in due course initiate them into hijra life. A chela is entitled to change his or her guru, but to do that, she or he must pay heavy sums of money in compensation for the loss of income to the current guru. Usually the money that changes hands between the new guru and the old guru is calculated in terms of the earning potential of the chela, which is in turn deduced from his or her reputation within the hijra word, how much he can earn at a dance party, for example. So any disputes between gurus over their jurisdiction, on neighborhoods, or on their chelas, are usually arbitrated by Hijra tradition, of which the senior gurus are entrusted as the custodians. Besides maintaining good reputation, or what Gayatri Riddhi calls izzat, a guru, especially a deredar guru, one who has a dera attached to him, maintains strategic alliances by giving gifts and paying tributes to influential gurus, maintaining cordial relations with police, and appreciating the heteronormative society for benevolently allowing Hijra existence in its midst. Hijra have long been part of South Asian culture or cultures with a certain degree of tolerance for the side of their existence which is concerned with performance of rituals. And a lot has been written on that. I just want to give you a glimpse of their social organization. In recent years, the Supreme Court of Pakistan gave a judgment that binds the Pakistani state to recognize Hijra as transgender or as a separate category from men and women, list them in electoral rolls as such, and issue their identity cards as belonging to a third gender, not woman, not men. The judgment also calls for equal employment opportunities for members of the third sex in state employment. This gesture of benevolence by highest judiciary has been celebrated and criticized from within and outside Hijra community. Critics are against any essentialized vision of Hijra identity, as Gayatri Reddy has argued while writing in the context of Hijra community in Hyderabad. And I quote, Hijra identities should be understood in terms of multiplicity of differences, including those of sexuality, religion, gender, kinship, and class. According to her, it is through these hierarchical differences that Hijras construct their experiences and enact their individuality. Reddy makes a number of important observations regarding how Hijras construct their identity. Firstly, they invoke their thirdness only when trying to prove their authenticity. So they're not essentialized third gender. They would be sometimes behaving like men, but they would invoke their thirdness only where they are pushed to prove that they're authentic. Secondly, embodied practice is central to the construction of Hijra identity. And thirdly, while body is the medium of izzat, or respect, body is the medium, izzat or respect is the primary criteria that motivates action. So to quote her again, izzat is the currency through which Hijra craft their identities and negotiate their relative status. Now, how all this is relevant to HIV prevention in Pakistan? So these elements of identity and social organization that I have just outlined, and which are also guided by hierarchical relations and patriarchal customs and tradition, stand in contrast to the international development's models of HIV prevention through democratic and progressive CBOs that the targeted interventions attempted to turn them into. I mean, imagine how a guru and chela would relate with each other as equals in a CBO setting, if you know the social organization of Hijra community that I have just outlined. So one of these targeted interventions was this multi-country South Asia Global Fund HIV program in 2001. So under this program, in Pakistan specifically, they imagined that they would build these 3 community-based organizations, these CBOs. And if you look at the list of these 6 CBOs which were to be established under this program for HIV prevention, only one is Khaja Sira Society. So Khaja Sira is another name for transgender. So one CBO would be for the Khaja Sira or Hijra or transgender people. Other 5 societies are named as male health societies. So you can't explicitly name them as MSM CBOs or MSM organizations. You have to hide behind the label male health in order to bring MSM together in a kind of community, in a kind of community-based organization. So in case of transgendered people, there was at least a community of Hijras. If you wanted to work on HIV prevention with transgender community, they were at least there. There were gurus, there were deras, there was a sense of community. People could work with them for HIV prevention. regardless of the fact that their culture was not really, or subculture was not really ideal for CBO, progressive, democratic kind of culture. You had to deal with patriarchal kind of relations of Guru Chela in order to work with them. But there was at least a community. But in case of the MSM, there was no such community on the ground. So you had to create that community in order to work for HIV prevention with them. So under this project then, and more generally, in targeted interventions for HIV prevention, privately homosexual men were called upon or interpolated to come out and identify themselves as MSM, that is, men who have sex with men, or MSWs, male sex workers, in order to become visible subjects of HIV prevention. Some individuals, such as Malish boys, young boys and men who provide massage for money in public parks and on footpaths, are those who like to hang out with Hijre and who didn't think of themselves as Hijre or MSM or MSW, were included in MSM category on the assumption that they were maintaining homosexual relations, whereas in fact even some Hijre might not be sexually active with men or with other Hijre, and some might even be monogamous heterosexual male with their wives and children back home in their villages. On defining MSM as a category of HIV-related interventions and the emphasis on creating CBOs, which were, and I quote from the literature, CBOs which were from MSM, of MSM, and by MSM, in projects like this multi-country South Asia Global Fund HIV program, sometimes my colleagues at the National AIDS Control Program joked whether they were all, or we were all MSM. They said that things happen in childhood, one of them said. Things happen in childhood, you know. If MSM includes those who ever had male-to-male sex, then we are all MSM, he laughed. So one wonders, if everyone is MSM, then what is the need for delineating this category and these CBOs for MSM? I won't go into great details of that kind of debate. Anthropologist Tom Bolistroff has written extensively on this question, including in his book, The Gay Archipelago, Sexuality and Nation in Indonesia. So I'll just stop that debate there. I'll move on. I'm not finished yet. So you might be wondering why HIV and Pakistan. One does not normally hear about these two things together. I will now talk about a little bit about the epidemic itself and the public response to the epidemic. As I have said before, by 1995, the number of known HIV positive people in Pakistan was no more than just over 1,000 in a population of 160 million. The government's response until then was a small laboratory-oriented NSCP at Islamabad, but when the numbers started to rise, some health experts raised the red flag. The government had to set up provincial AIDS control programs in all 4 provinces. These developments also reflected changes at international stage, where UNAIDS was established in 1996, and there was an increased attention to the epidemic globally. By 2003, donor funding constituted only 20% of the total HIV/AIDS-related spending in Pakistan. Some UN agencies provided small grants to various government departments and a few large NGOs for HIV/AIDS prevention activities. In particular, the NGO Population Service International worked with local partners to carry out behavioral research and behavior change communication activities among female sex workers and truckers. Other international NGOs funded projects with students, teachers, Afghan refugees. So this was in the 1990s. International aid to Pakistan decreased sharply following its nuclear explosion in 1998, resulting in a crisis of foreign exchange reserves and economic instability in the country. The World Bank and other leading institutions met the shortfall in donor funding by extending loans on the condition of certain adjustments, which included privatization of health sector. Also in 1998, the World Bank issued a health strategy paper for Pakistan, which recommended that the health sector should enter into partnership with the private sector in order to provide government-financed health services. Economic sanctions were lifted in 2001 after 9/11, when Pakistan became a key partner in the war on terror. So US aid reopened its offices and the flow of bilateral and multilateral aid started again. This coincided with a wider focus amongst global health agencies on HIV/AIDS epidemic in Asia and the discovery of several new cases in Pakistan. Thus, HIV/AIDS became a favored area of donor funding, with the World Bank providing the overarching framework of contracting out HIV prevention services to the private sector. HIV prevention became an area of urgent intervention. The rationale was well rehearsed. If the epidemic was not contained within risk populations where it was currently believed to be concentrated, the virus would spread to the general population. A particular concern of the policymakers was the high level of injecting drug use, as drug trafficking for arms during the Afghan War of 1980s had left hundreds and thousands of heroin and opium addicts as a legacy. Behavioral studies among drug users in the late 1990s had indicated that there were alarmingly high rates of needle sharing and other risky practices. In 2004, biobehavioral surveys of injecting drug users in major cities indicated that there were up to 25%, or 1 in 4 injecting drug users were infected with HIV. So that's how they depicted the doomsday, basically. So there were HIV concentrations in particular areas which were spreading throughout Pakistan. We needed to do something about it. And World Bank said, I got money. There you go. So there was enough epidemiological evidence for a concentrated epidemic on the ground and a fear of generalized epidemic that led to scaling up of HIV response on the World Bank's advice and offer of a multi-million-dollar soft loan. So a certain injection of new funds, to use Paul Farmer's words, by the World Bank was consistent with the tripling of development aid for health internationally over the same period. Accompanying these funds came what Joe Bale and Petriana would call a new technocracy of economistic assessment techniques and a sovereignty of metrics identifying what works and what does not. Thus, scaling up involved more than a simple expansion of services. The World Bank's involvement brought together a vast assemblage of resources, manpower, expertise, strategies, and technologies, a culture of practice in which new ideological frameworks became dominant and normalized, including philosophies of efficiency, transparency, participation, capacity building, and empowerment, and as I will argue, perhaps an unjustifiable emphasis on involving religious leaders in HIV prevention. Thus, HIV prevention services were contracted out by the government to the private sector, that is NGOs and for-profit organizations in some cases. The rationale for contracting out to NGOs, despite the widespread presence of public health facilities in target areas, was the presumed, and I say presumed is important, presumed inability of the state to work with risk groups of HIV who were criminalized by the law, such as MSM. Now here is the conundrum. On the one hand, the risk groups continue to be the targets of intervention and policies for HIV prevention, and on the other hand, the rights of individuals belonging to these risk groups are not protected in law. So what is the state doing then? On whose side is it? Human rights literature has documented pathologically high levels of discrimination and contempt towards sex workers, injecting drug users, transgendered, hijre, and has reported of their harassment, intimidation, arrest, and incarceration, and of the demand of bribes, sexual favors, and other abuses of power by police authorities. So literature is full of all those atrocities against the high-risk populations. In public discourse also, you often come across some of these events which journalists find interesting to report, but there is a lot of unreported stuff going on as well, where the members of so-called high-risk groups are subjected to a lot of violence, not only by the state authorities, but also by common people in the neighborhoods. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the legal context as well, because that is important when we talk about public morality. The existing laws in Pakistan criminalize the non-therapeutic use of drugs through the Control of Narcotics Acts Narcotic Substances Act 1997, and also penalized homosexuality, prostitution, and adultery. Under the Pakistan Penal Code, Section 377, titled Unnatural Offences, the punishment for anal intercourse, also called unnatural offense or a carnal intercourse against the law of nature, is potentially imprisonment for life. The penal code was inherited from the British colonial administration of India, introduced in 1862. In recent years, scholarly critiques have concluded that it was introduced in an attempt by the colonizers to impose Victorian values on Indian polity and society. With reference to Section 377, scholars have argued that homosexuality was a comfortable social reality in pre-colonial India. Of Victorian England, too, historians have drawn attention to the secret worlds of prostitution, pornography, and a strong homosexual counterculture opposed to the moral teachings about sacrosanct nature of reproduction. So this is Section 377, in case you were wondering. Legal historians have emphasized that the Indian Penal Code was not a straightforward replica of English law, as English law did not have a criminal code. They draw attention to the fact that British were able to institute the Indian Penal Code. That very fact illustrates that the imperial powers were often able to do in their colonies what they were unable to do at home. Laws such as Section 377 continue to persist in many post-colonial countries. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, in fact, the Indian Supreme Court has repealed this law in a historic decision which has been much celebrated by sexual minority activists and rights groups. But this came after a long-drawn struggle against the status quo. In Pakistan, this law continues to criminalize certain forms of sexuality and produce quasi-legal populations of homosexual men. Similarly, convictions under the West Pakistan Suppression of Prostitution Ordinance of 1961 are also subject to the provisions of 1898 Criminal Procedure Code of the colonial times. So that legacy continues, and 377 has been seen as part of the legacy of colonialism. Adding further to the severity of these laws, General Ziaul Haq has, when he was around, he made extramarital sex or zina punishable by death under the infamous Hudud ordinances, promulgated in 1979 as part of his attempt to Islamize the Pakistani state and its society during his military dictatorship in 1980s. Even after the return to democracy in 1989, it has been argued that the dominant nationalist notions, together with their cultural practices around public morality and secrecy, act against the discussion of sexuality in public sphere. Some scholars have noticed that the taboo on public discourse of sexuality coexists with sexually charged subcultures of young men, with the explicit representation of female body in film posters and mujra dances, and with the titillating stock figure of the courtesan in popular culture. In other words, out-of-marriage sex or same-sex sexual relations have not, surprisingly, have not ceased to be, despite these harsh legal punishments or moral sanctions. In fact, many people argue that there is a tacit acceptance of homosexuality in rural and urban areas of Pakistan as long as it is not talked about. However, public morality and law are clear. Same-sex sexual relations are unacceptable. So in strictly legal terms, distributing condoms to MSM can also get you into trouble, because that can be construed as a criminal conspiracy, because you're facilitating people to commit a crime by distributing condoms to MSM. And that can land you in prison, because you're breaking the Pakistan Penal Code Section 120B for aiding and abetting a crime. So as one of my informants said in a lighter mood, even NSCP, that is the government, is breaking the law. So giving a condom to an MSM is actually breaking the law. Instead of addressing these discriminatory legal provisions, the NSCP initiated a piece of legislation in 2007, the HIV/AIDS Prevention and Treatment Act. This initiative was premised on the claim that the at-risk populations and their family members experience a lack of human rights protection and discrimination and are marginalized by their legal status, which may disempower them into avoiding to seek HIV tests and prevention-related measures. A justifiable premise, one can argue. But ironically, the main thrust of the proposed legislation was to guarantee protection against arrest, detention, and harassment of NGO workers and staff rather than the protection of the members of the so-called high-risk groups themselves. Even this proposed legislation could not see light of the day. It could not be moved beyond the stage of vetting at the Ministry of Law because people didn't really like HIV/AIDS-related legislation. Meanwhile, I'll read it from here. Easy access to male dating apps because of advancement in technology and availability of inexpensive gadgets is the reason for AIDS hike, said Sophia Furkan, a senior program officer with the National AIDS Control Program. So that's the kind of discourse which circulates in the public domain at the same time. And this is not coming from someone on the street. It's a responsible communication officer of the state who is making these statements. So within the state's AIDS bureaucracy, many officials were not convinced that the public funds should be spent on organizing socially and morally undesirable individuals for their empowerment or even on spending these limited resources for health on HIV/AIDS at the expense of more pressing needs and morally unproblematic health issues. For example, one colleague told me that the very idea of empowering MSM was disgusting because they are sinners. Another colleague in the National AIDS bureaucracy snapped at an MSM activist in a meeting when the activist tried to make a case for government support for MSM CBOs. The AIDS control official told him, "This is against the law of the Quran. How can we support you in something that is against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?" Now, that's the kind of discourse that you often came across during these meetings where there was discussion of targeted interventions among MSM or changes in the law. But then compare that with the fact that when these people work together on grant proposals for international donors, such as the Global Fund, they were very careful to highlight phrases like rights of sexual minorities, and to emphasize how their participation in policy was essential. And I was part of some of these meetings where someone would say, "Oh, do highlight that, do put sexual minorities." It is the phrases like these which earn us this funding. So they were doing that at the same time, but then they were also arguing that this was all sexual minorities. What is that? That is against the law of Quran, and we don't recognize it. This is Islamic country, and we don't want to do it. So the question for me is how these colleagues reconciled the legal sanctions and the public morality of condemning MSM, to which they seem to conform, with another kind of morality at play here, the morality of international development, of equal human rights, of sexual freedoms, of the rights of sexual minorities. So how do they live with these both things? So reflecting on similar contradictions, I wrote in my field notes, and I quote, "No matter how much they detest homosexuality in their private lives and or in their public persona, actors like Dr. X must conform to a different set of morals in their official duties, otherwise they'll be thrown out of their jobs in development sector. I suppose that some of these actors will eventually resolve the conflicting moralities within themselves through a process of subjectivation by doing what they do or what they must do repeatedly in their official capacities as performativity of doing. Others may continue to live double lives." Now, when I think back about how I felt at that time, I tell myself that maybe it was not so much about living double lives as it was about working pragmatically within the limits of what was legally possible, and sometimes also gently pushing those limits. For example, ignoring Section 120B of the Penal Code, which criminalizes condom distribution in a strict legal sense. An MSM activist in Lahore confided in me that an AIDS control official from another province had invited him to and I quote, come and establish an underground network of sex workers in our province. Likewise, the country coordinator of UNAIDS, so there were voices like that. He won't say that publicly to an MSM activist, come and set up underground network of sex workers in my province as well. He won't say that in meetings, but he said that to this individual in a private kind of capacity. So he was condemning homosexuality, but at the same time, or sex work in public meetings, but he was at the same time trying to get this MSM worker to come to his province and set up a network of sex workers and MSM to empower them for HIV prevention. So similar kind of thing I heard from the UNAIDS country coordinator as well, who told me very candidly in his interview, suppose I say to the government, the parliamentarians, or the higher judiciary that I would like to change the laws on sodomy. They will show me the door, he said, and they will tell me to get out. What's the point then? You have to be realistic in what you can achieve in a given cultural, social, and legal context. This is the whole controversy, he said. Some people say you are not pushing the policy, and some say that if you push the policy, they will close the whole show. Personally, I'm on the side of pushing the policy. Let me now turn to the religious leaders more directly, explicitly. In 2004, the NSCP and the UNICEF Pakistan launched a Religious Leaders Initiative for HIV/AIDS. A number of other countries, including Malaysia, Iran, Bangladesh, and Senegal, had already introduced programs involving religious leaders. But this was the first time that they tried to build an organization which was wholly owned and run by religious leaders. The initiative was later designated as the Inter-Religious Council on HIV/AIDS and registered as an NGO. Later on, HIV/AIDS was dropped from the name, and it became the Inter-Religious Council on Health, because the religious leaders realized that they did not really like HIV/AIDS in the title. An expatriate UNICEF staff who was working very closely with these religious leaders told me in her interview, and I quote, and it's a long quote, bear with me, and she said, religious leaders don't take the message forward. They might be initially enthusiastic, but after that, it does not go anywhere. That was our problem. There was a lot of issues in working with them. We took them to South Africa on an exposure visit. I had to babysit Abdul Rashid Ghazi. He said to the head of UNICEF in South Africa, well, is it not that women get raped because they are not wearing enough clothes? Some of them, she continued, some of them were great. Like there was this one from Balochistan. He was like, oh yes. He liked to sit on our child protection life skill committees. When we would ask him, would you introduce this course in your madrasa? He would say, oh yes, no, but we'll start it, but So there was a lot of yes, but then going back to their constituency and passing these messages on, that did not happen. So this was a rather long quote from UNICEF's focal person who was working with religious leaders. The focal person at the National AIDS Control Program, which is the state's department, was also a woman. And she was responsible for coordinating with religious leaders. She had to resign from her post because she could not handle them, according to her successor. He was referring to the difficulties created by the misuse of funds by the executives of the religious council, who proved to be cowpiolog, or people who were involved in embezzlement. The secretariat of the council had to be shut down due to a lack of funds or their mismanagement. With no secretariat of its own, the NGO had to be hosted at the NSCP. The Secretary General, a local imam, was given a table and a chair and a computer. His salary was supported by UNICEF. He killed his time by making free phone calls and occasionally arranged advocacy sessions with local religious figures who, according to one NSCP colleague, came mainly because of the free lunches provided at those sessions. In the heydays of the council, the General Secretary went to the NSCP focal person, the Secretary General went with the NSCP focal person to various districts for orientation sessions with religious leaders. These sessions focused on virtues of early marriage and how HIV was a result of moving away from religion. Any mention of condoms was seen as a dialogue killer, a recipe for disaster. Hence, the subject was generally avoided, whereas talking about sexual activity, specifically sexual promiscuity, as a cause of HIV was kind of a music to their ear, according to this coordinator, the focal person at NSCP. That's something that charged them up, and they love to speak about sexual promiscuity. Nothing against religious leaders, but yeah. So, colleagues at the NSCP often joked about having to spend time with these religious figures, colloquially called Maulvis, in advocacy sessions, and doubted their credentials for influencing public opinion on matters related to HIV. Yet they carried on to work with them in their official capacity and pretended that these imams had great influence on public opinion. As for the orientation sessions at district level, I was told that although they had managed to cover only 23 districts, they wrote in their reports that they had covered 45. One can imagine the kind of influence they might be having on their colleagues in the NSCP or vice versa, let alone their influence on public opinion about HIV. The new focal person at the NSCP shared with me some of his difficulties of working with religious leaders. Initially, they questioned the source of funding for HIV prevention and the government's promotion of condoms, sensing some kind of Western conspiracy against Muslims. They also lamented the lack of action by the government on shutting down fahashi ke adde, or the dens of obscenity, such as internet clubs and DVD shops. This, according to them, was necessary to clamp down immorality in society, which they believed was the main cause of diseases like HIV/AIDS. The focal person's standard response to these kind of questions was to strategically limit condom promotion for married couples only, and that also only for those married couples where one individual was HIV positive and the couple wanted to continue sexual relations. Since sex was a sunnah of the Prophet, that is something that the Prophet himself did and did not forbid his followers from doing, therefore it would be an act of charity to enable married HIV-affected couples to continue their sexual relations. The focal person emphasized this, apparently attempting to speak to them in their language. However, like the UNICEF official, he was not entirely convinced that the religious leaders were committed to spreading HIV prevention messages. He said about them, and I quote, "When they're in their community, their thoughts are different than when they speak to us. In front of us, they say they agree with us, but when they go back, they say these things, that is talking about HIV prevention, should not happen. Sex," so end of quote, "sex as a theme was thus unworthy of the sanctity of the mimbar or pulpit." An official assessment of the Inter-Religious Council also raised similar concerns. It reported that only on a few occasions did these religious leaders publicly speak about HIV in their communities, and that even that was done in the context of A, denunciation of sexual immorality, B, condemnation of modernity and Western civilization, and C, often a call for the implementation of Islamic Sharia as the only way out for the moral morass. Thus, the report raised questions about the reinforcing of self-righteous sexual moralism and a lack of shift in the position of religious leaders. In fact, if there was any shift, it was the other way around. It might have been the one in opposite direction, not shift in the thinking of religious leaders by involving them, but shift in the thinking of maybe people who were working with MSM. So for instance, the information kit on HIV prevention that was jointly prepared by religious leaders and NSCP has sections titled such as "Some Facts About Sexual Perversion and the Presence of HIV/AIDS Among the Muslim Ummah," and unnecessary delays in marriage, which according to the information kit increases the trend of illegitimate relationship and homosexuality, which according to the info kit is totally un-Islamic and increasing. The toolkit blames foreign imported culture and obscene literature affecting our present generation with processes of modernization, taking us far beyond our moral and spiritual norms with obvious results. As you can see, I'm quoting from the information kit for youth that the state is preparing with the help of these religious leaders. So what was the point of involving religious leaders? I mean, you can tell from this. What was the point of involving religious leaders? What was in it for them, let's say? According to a senior religious scholar quoted in the assessment report, in meetings and workshops, they say things that they do not really believe in, simply because saying these things enhances their position. So he was thus hinting that their involvement serves them economic and political gains and the prestige of working with the state functionaries. As for the AIDS officials who were required to work with the religious leaders, my impression is that they carried out this work as another template of international health and development, just like the risk group population, for instance. After all, the idea of risk groups, the policy of involving religious leaders also traveled, to use David Moss's term, from other places. Successful role played by religious leaders in Senegal, Uganda, and Thailand was often quoted in NSCP official documents as a rationale and as an example to follow. One should also not forget that the whole initiative of involving religious leaders in HIV prevention was part of the broader UNICEF Asia Regional Initiative on Faith-Motivated Action on HIV/AIDS Prevention, which started in the year 2000. So I have no conclusions to offer. As I said in the beginning, this is something that I'm thinking about and I wanted to share with you for your feedback. I have no conclusion to offer other than that I look forward to your questions and suggestions for the possible directions that this could take. While the question of conflicting moralities of actors and the traveling rationalities of international health and development that I have just described is important and one that I want to pursue, one thing has become clear, that the involvement of religious leaders through the jointly prepared information kit has unfortunately added in NSCP's lexicon phrases like sexual perversion, which was not there before, to describe male and male-to-male sex, and has endorsed the othering of the disease by associating it with foreign culture and modernization. Similarly, early marriages as HIV prevention strategy is insensitive to the issues of gender and development, and linking condom use to married HIV-positive individuals only is also not going to help HIV prevention. I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Ayaz.